Om Sri Sai Ram. My humble salutations to my beloved Bhagwan, respected elders and my dear students. Hearty welcome to number theory class, unit number 5, theorem number 14. So this gives a methodology by which we can calculate Legendre symbol minus 1 by p and the Legendre symbol 2 by p. So the statement is like this. If p is an odd positive integer, then Legendre symbol minus 1 by p value is equal to minus 1 to the power of p minus 1 by 2, and the Legendre symbol 2 by p value equal to minus 1 whole to the power of p square minus 1 by 8. Now let us say p is can be written as the product of primes p1, p2, etc. pk. Then the Legendre symbol minus 1 by p is equal to the Legendre symbol minus 1 by p1, p2, etc. pk. That is equal to minus 1 by p1 into Legendre symbol minus 1 by p2, etc. Legendre symbol minus 1 by pk. Now by previous theorem we know that the value of this is nothing but minus 1 to the power of p1 minus 1 by 2 into minus 1 whole to the power of p2 minus 1 by 2, etc. minus 1 whole to the power of pk minus 1 by 2. So this is nothing but minus 1 to the power of p1 minus 1 by 2 plus p2 minus 1 by 2 plus etc. plus pk minus 1 by 2. So the sum of all these powers is nothing but p minus 1 by 2, because summation pi minus 1 by 2 I running from 1 to k mod 2 is equal to p minus 1 by 2. Now I am going to show that p minus 1 by 2 equal to the summation of these k terms, that is p1 minus 1 by 2 plus p2 minus 1 by 2 plus etc. pk minus 1 by 2. In order to prove this, first of all consider the product, first two products, that is p1 into p2. p1 can be add and subtract in the first term 1 plus 1 and minus 1. Similarly for p2 also add 1 and minus 1. So now p1 p2 is nothing but the product of two factors. First one is 1 plus p1 minus 1 and the second factor is 1 plus p2 minus 1. When you multiply we are going to get four terms, namely 1 plus p1 minus 1 plus p2 minus 1 plus p1 minus 1 into p2 minus 1. But what is p1 minus 1? p1 is an integer, odd integer. p1 minus 1 becomes automatically it is an even number, and similarly p2 minus 1 is also an even number. So the product of these two will be divisible by, so 4 divides p1 minus 1 into p2 minus 1. In other words, p1 minus 1 into p2 minus 1 is congruent to 0 mod 4. So finally we conclude that the product p1 into p2 is nothing but, instead of 4 terms we are going to get only the 3 terms, namely 1 plus p1 minus 1 plus p2 minus 1 mod 4. Similarly now we consider the product of first 3 terms, that is p1 p2 into p3, which is congruent to the first product p1 p2 is nothing but, just now we have proved, that is nothing but 1 plus p1 minus 1 in plus p2 minus 1 into, just like before, p3 can also be written by adding 1 and subtracting minus 1 mod 4. So finally p1 p2 p3 is congruent to, again product of two factors. The first factor is 1 plus p1 minus 1 plus p2 minus 1, and the second factor is 1 plus p3 minus 1 mod. Once again when you multiply this we are going to get that is we are going to get 6 terms. So 1 plus p1 minus 1 plus p2 minus 1 plus p3 minus 1 plus p1 minus 1 into p3 minus 1 plus p2 minus 1 into p3 minus 1 mod 4. Clearly like before, the product of two terms automatically they are congruent to 0 mod 4, just like before. So instead of 6 terms we are going to have only the 4 terms, namely 1 plus single terms only, p1 minus 1 plus p2 minus 1 plus p3 minus 1 mod 4. In continuation of this, the product P1 into P2 into etc. Pk is nothing but 1 plus P1 minus 1 plus P2 minus 1 plus P3 minus 1 plus etc. And the last term is going to be Pk minus 1 mod whole. So what is the P1, P2 etc. Pk? That is nothing but P. P is congruent to 1 plus P1 minus 1 plus P2 minus 1 plus P3 minus 1 plus etc. Pk minus 1 mod whole. So when you bring 1 onto the left side, you get P minus 1 is congruent to P1 minus 1 plus P2 minus 1 plus P3 minus 1 plus etc. Pk minus 1 mod whole. Now divide throughout the equation by 2. So P1 minus 1 by 2 is congruent to P1 minus 1 plus P2 minus 1 plus P3 minus 1 plus etc. Pk minus 1 whole divided by 2 mod 2. So this is nothing but, once again, we are having. So finally we conclude that P minus 1 by 2 is nothing but congruent to summation of Pi minus 1 by 2 mod 2. I running from 1 to k. So finally we conclude that minus 1 by P is equal to minus 1 whole to the power of P minus 1 by 2. This is how we have completed the first prop. Now we are going to play plane number 2, that is 2 by P. We are going to calculate 2 by P, Legendre symbol 2 by P. Once again, we consider P is equal to nothing but the product of primes, that is P1 into P2 into etc. Pk. Now 2 by P is equal to 2 by P1 into P2 into etc. Pk. That is nothing but 2 by P1 into Legendre symbol 2 by P2 etc. Legendre symbol 2 by Pk. Now this is nothing but minus 1 to the power of this becomes P1 square minus 1 by 8, and the second term is going to be minus 1 whole to the power of P2 square minus 1 by 8, and so on, minus 1 to the power of Pk square minus 1 by 8. So on further simplification, this is nothing but minus 1 whole to the power of P1 square minus 1 by 8 plus P2 square minus 1 by 8 plus etc. Pk square minus 1 by 8. So like before, we can easily show that the sum of these terms is nothing but P square minus 1 by 8, because we know that P square minus 1 by 8 is congruent to summation Pi square minus 1 by 8, I running from 1 to k mod 8. Now how to prove this? P1 square into P2 square, just like before. Once again we can have add and subtract plus 1 and minus 1 to each term. So now we can write this as product of two factors, namely 1 plus P1 square minus 1 into 1 plus P2 square minus 1. Now when you multiply this, we are going to get 4 terms, namely 1 plus P1 square minus 1 plus P2 square minus 1 plus P1 square minus 1 into P2 square minus 1. Now P1 is an odd number, so let us say 2k plus 1. So P1 square becomes, what is that? 2k plus 1 whole square. That is nothing but 4k square plus 1 plus 4k. In other words, similarly we can say that P2 square minus 1 is also equal to 4k square plus 4k. Now P2 square minus 1 equal to, so finally we can put 4k into k plus 1. So we can write this as some 8q. Therefore 64 divides the product of these two factors, that is P1 square minus 1 into P2 square minus 1. That implies the product P1 square minus 1 into P2 square minus 1. Therefore, finally we conclude that P1 square P2 square is congruent to 1 plus P1 square minus 1 plus P2 square minus 1 mod 64. Similarly, on continuing further, we see that P1 square into P2 square etc. Pk square is nothing but 1 plus P1 square minus 1 plus P2 square minus 1 plus etc. Pk square minus 1 mod 64. Now the left hand side is nothing but P square, so that is congruent to 1 plus p1 square minus 1 plus p2 square minus 1 plus etc. pk square minus 1. So bringing minus 1 to the left hand side, we get p square minus 1 is congruent to p1 square minus 1 plus p2 square minus 1 plus etc. pk square minus 1 mod 64. Dividing the equation by 8, we get p square minus 1 by 8 is congruent to p1 square minus 1 plus p2 square minus 1 plus etc. pk square minus 1 whole divided by 8 mods 8. So in other words, we can write this as p square minus 1 by 8 equal to summation pi square minus 1 by 8 mod 8, I running from 1 to k. Thus finally we conclude that 2 by p is equal to, that is Legendre symbol 2 by p is equal to minus 1 whole to the power of p square minus 1 by 8. Thank you for watching this video.